It's a real privilege to be up here with this panel, and someone who's the kind of outlier lacking any kind of real-world experience. All I do is teach. But I've titled my remarks tonight, and I'm going to shed the cloak of academic, not honesty, but I don't know why I said that cloak. But shed the cloak of being unbiased, because this is a college democratic event, and because this is more true to my analysis of things. So I call my remarks tonight Reflections on Exiting a War That Seems to Be Just Part of the Routine. I want to start with a little note about public opinion and how Democrats, as a college democratic event, how Democrats can capitalize on the opposition to the war as a means to bring it to a close. And then I want to reflect on what's at stake in Iraq and on what an exit strategy might need to do. Public opinion historically, and I'm not going to bore you with regression analysis here, though I could have, has historically had the least significant influence on foreign policy making. So let me say that again. What the public cares about doesn't matter for foreign policy decisions in the United States. In fact, it falls way behind what business wants and what epistemic communities, like think tanks, right, or defense policy institutes, these kinds of things, what they want. Public opinion is least statistically significant in influencing U.S. foreign policy making. But where the public's importance comes into play depends on issue saliency, issue type, and institutional setting. It turns out, in fact, that public opinion matters most for members of the House of Representatives. I think the Republicans found this out in the last midterm elections. However pressing these findings might be for democracy, there's a lesson that when the public develops a strong opinion about foreign policy, or a foreign policy issue, that they see as salient, to cut against the public is to risk electoral backlash. To my mind, then, if we look at polling information, the American public has settled its opinion on the war in Iraq. It was ill-advised, ill-conceived, and it must end. Moreover, not even the military successes of the surge have significantly reversed this turn against the war. In short, this is a winning issue, especially for Democratic congressional candidates, and it should be more central to Democratic campaigns this fall. If John McCain and the Republicans want to run Iraq, my advice to Democrats would be to quote George Bush, bring it on. What's at stake in the question of how to end the war in Iraq? Well, first, as earlier speakers illustrated, the question of what will happen to security in Iraq. And because, as political scientists have demonstrated again in the case of Iraq, that insecurity is linked with xenophobia and with in-group solidarity, security seems self-evidently related to the emergence of a unified, stable Iraq. In other words, there needs to be security before there can be a stable, unified Iraq across the different ethnic divides. The second issue that's at stake, I think, are the costs. For me, the costs, both financial and in world opinion, of staying in Iraq are already too prohibitive. And finally, there are some who say if we get out, our enemies, namely Iran and Al-Qaeda, will win. So in developing an exit strategy, I think that Democrats must find a way to simultaneously address all three of these issues. In short, what's needed is a strategy to end the war, to win the peace, to secure our interests in the region, and though this is going to be very vague, here's what this might look like. First, the most salient issue for voters is usually, Bill Clinton was here today, so it's usually the economy, stupid. So I think Democrats should do more to highlight the economic costs of this war and to link the war to our current economic situation. Because I think, make no mistake about it, part of the economic crisis we're facing today, part of it is certainly explained by the massive bill going to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan every month. Second, when it comes to what's in our national interest, I think we ought to refocus on how 5 years of occupation, combined with disengagement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a historically untenable position of never speaking to our enemies, has affected our image in the broader region, in the broader Middle East. From Egypt to the United Arab Emirates, to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Turkey, the overall image of the United States has become solidly unfavorable. And the view of our handling of Iraq has been even worse. The Democrats ought to focus on the fact that our interests in the region are not simply confined to Iraq, but rather that the lingering occupation in Iraq has diminished our power in the world by turning the tide of public opinion against the United States. Furthermore, Democrats need to make the case that the longer we're in Iraq, the longer we allow Iran to present itself as as the flag bearer in the broader Middle East for opposition to the United States. As long as we're there, Iran gains esteem throughout the region as being the dominant force of opposition to the United States. When President Bush led us into Iraq, it involved, I think, a failure to learn from comparative politics. You should have taken my class. Steadfast in pursuing a war, he and his advisors constructed as being squarely within the realist pursuit of U.S. national interests, and in line with liberal ideas of spreading democratic norms through force if necessary, the Bush team failed to understand the history of Iraq and the nature of the Saddam Hussein regime. In a quick toppling of the Ba'athist regime, somehow the Bush team failed to consider the salience of subnational identities in a country bound together by fear, not by national pride. Somehow they also failed to consider just how depoliticized and deinstitutionalized Iraq had become after so many years of dictatorship. To me, though, the failure of discussion about Iraq today is a failure to learn from international relations. Again, my class. Steadfast in focusing on Iraq, we have lost sight of our other strategic and normative interests in the region. I side with those in the Iraq Study Group and on the Council of Foreign Relations who have advocated augmenting, if not supplementing, a diplomatic and political approach for the military one that continues to dominate U.S. foreign policy. An end to the war surely won't mean an end to our use of soft power to stabilize and rebuild Iraq, but it will mean we can once again realize that our regional interests are not confined to Iraq. The final question is the question of security in Iraq. This is what I'm kind of punt on. Here let me just say that the U.S. withdrawal may in fact, as others have illustrated, create the opportunity for renewed sectarian violence or the re-emergence of Al-Qaeda, but because of the financial and political costs, we can't afford to stay in Iraq for 10 more years or 100 more years. We need to work through international organizations to help build institutions that allow Iraqis to do this work themselves. It may turn out that without the U.S. as the face of the occupation, insurgents might diminish in importance. And if the history of state building in other countries is analogous, if Iraq can create better political institutions, a fight against threats to the regime may do more to unify the country than a security imposed by a foreign occupation could ever. Let me close by saying that on this, the eve of the 5th anniversary of this war, with 160,000 troops still in the country, with cost estimates skyrocketing, with the American public tired of the war, with the American death toll nearing 4,000, with the rest of the world disillusioned with how the war has been handled, the time has come for Democrats to seize this issue. The war points to a failure of Bush and Republican foreign policies. It exacerbates the failure of Republican economic policies. And it is time for Democrats to start making this argument and put forth the political will to bring the war to an end.